Hi, my name's Shelley Rowd, and I'm just going to talk through the new WHS regulations for crystalline silica substances. We've had a few inquiries on these, so we've decided to put together a brief presentation on what's included in these regulations. So first of all, this is the MAQOHSC disclaimer. I'm going to talk about things in law. So every effort has been made to ensure that the information presented is complete and accurate. However, before you make any decisions on legal issues, legal advice should be obtained from a legal practitioner. And if you have any questions on anything that's presented today, please do contact us. So what I'm going to talk through today is a little bit on dust exposure, the health effects, and what the regulations have in them relating to crystalline silica and silicosis prevention. So why do we have new crystalline silica substances regulations in the work health and safety legislation? Well, the work health and safety legislation has for 20 years covered controls for respirable crystalline silica exposures. However, due to a recent emergence of disease in the engineered stone industry and also the ongoing low-level disease in other industries, the ministers have decided to add in extra regulations for requirements for crystalline silica processes. And those processes, which we are still seeing disease detected in, are things like using power tools or mechanical equipment on something that contains silica, using road headers to excavate material, quarrying, mechanical screening or tunnelling through material with silica in, and of course, any process that exposes a person to respirable crystalline silica particles on a regular basis is going to have a risk of giving that person disease and therefore be captured in these new regulations. So, what is a crystalline silica substance? Well, for the purposes of the regulations, we're including all materials with at least 1% crystalline silica by weight of concentration. And when that material is exposed to workers as a respirable dust. So a respirable dust is a dust of less than 10 microns in terms of health. And the reason we're worried about that is firstly, unfortunately, I'm in front of this bit of the chart, but firstly, because at very small levels, it stays in the air for quite a number of minutes to hours, depending on how finely fractured that dust is, and therefore can be breathed in. And secondly, because dust entry into the respiratory system is based on size. So respirable dust can be respired. It goes down into the lower parts of the lungs. Larger particles of dust, like crystalline silica beach sand, stops at your nasal passage or upper respiratory area and doesn't actually cause the sort of harm that we see from tiny fine particles causing silicosis in that lower region of the lungs. This slide also notes that dust particles less than 30 microns aren't visible. So workers can be breathing in very fine dust in dust clouds that they don't actually know they're breathing in. So it's quite a serious risk. And for many years, MAQOHSC has done reports for businesses on a range of activities that align quite a lot to the processes in the regulations. And those reports have shown that most of the activities where dust is produced in mines and quarries will produce exposures that can be above the 0.05 milligrams per cubic metre exposure standard and definitely over half that exposure standard. So they are a risk to health. Recently, some of the other states have shown in their cases of mine dust lung disease that there is an increasing prevalence of disease now when doctors are presented with patients regularly to monitor. We can see that COPD, silicosis and other diseases are on the increase from being exposed to dust. In South Australia, we haven't routinely screened our workers until recently. So we haven't got a graph like this to show you for South Australia, but definitely from Queensland and New South Wales, we can show these sorts of trends. So as I said before, the regulations already existed, the hierarchy of control for managing risk. So managing dust should have been managed in line with the hierarchy of controls. Obviously for engineered stone, the ban has produced elimination. We've eliminated the risk. Materials are coming in with a much lower level of silica, so that's kind of substitution if we're still doing those processes. Then you use isolation, engineering and administrative controls to manage risk. And the new regulations will talk a bit about having to put in place PPE if you haven't completely controlled the risk. So this is our dust hierarchy of control. Elimination is eliminating dust exposure before it can occur. So do you have to grind up or cut something? Substitution is changing your activity to generate less dust, perhaps. Isolation is our very important enclosures and cabins in mining that we put workers in to prevent them from being exposed to dust. Engineering controls, water sprays and other things that we put in place to try and dampen down the dust once we have generated it if we couldn't prevent its generation. And then administrative controls of shift length, exposure, maintenance, and last of all, our personal protective equipment if we do want to just protect that worker's respiratory tract. So the new legislation on processing crystalline silica substances says that a process is controlled when you've got at least one of the following. So you have to isolate the person from the dust, as we said, have really good cabins in place, use effective wet dust suppression methods, on-tool extraction, or local exhaust ventilation to take the dust out of the worker's breathing zone. So cabin filtration and checking cabin filtration will be quite a critical piece of evidence to prove compliance with this regulation. So again, the sorts of things we expect to see on sites that are crushing and moving material, wetting roads, strategically placed sprays and foam being used, and wetting agents on haul roads. These are all things that MAQOHSC can talk to you about if you don't have these items on site, specifically the strategic use of water sprays. Peter Williams may be able to assist you with. Now, if you have all of these in place, but you still don't have everything controlled, you are required to provide workers with fit, tested and appropriate respiratory protective equipment. And selecting that will be based on the exposure that you've measured in the work environment. So you do have to measure the exposure to workers to determine what respiratory protection you give them. And air monitoring and health monitoring are both quite prominent in this new regulation. So guidance has been produced to document the new crystalline silica substance laws, and there's a flow chart that is in the guidance that goes through a kind of yes and no questioning. So are you doing a process that is defined in the regulations, more than 1% silica in one of those detailed processes where you're going to create respirable crystalline silica? If it's yes, then you have to conduct an assessment to decide if it's high risk. One of the criteria which we'll go through for high risk means that most of the mining and quarrying activities, engineered stone activities would all be high risk because we have measured them. If your process is high risk, then you have to continue doing your air monitoring, you have to continue doing health monitoring, and as I said, MAQOHSC is happy to facilitate both those processes. If you think your process is not high risk, then you are going to have to create some evidence in line with the information and the guidance that you can present to a regulator that says, I don't need a silica risk control plan because I'm not high risk and these are the reasons why. So health monitoring will still be provided by MAQOHSC. At the moment, we are sending people for a chest HRCT and following up with respiratory tests. There is a callback period of 12 months, 2 years or 5 years, depending on what the findings are of our initial screening. For workplaces, this covers your health monitoring requirements for lung only, but it doesn't cover the other health monitoring things that you're required to do in the regulations for hearing tests, etc., etc. But we're happy to help facilitate the lung screening of workers in South Australia. So in the new regulations, there is a requirement for a silica risk control plan. And to decide if you need a silica risk control plan, it's deciding if your business is exposing workers to a harmful level of silica. So you do need to know the estimated silica content of your material, the percentage, so if it's more than that 1%, the likely duration of each worker's exposure, and your current dust prevention strategies are in place and working. So as before, I said, we've suggested monitoring is the only real way to determine what your worker exposures are, and businesses are required to get an occupational hygienist in to do that personal monitoring at regular intervals. There's also a requirement to train workers who may be at risk of exposure, and you have to train them in both the risks associated with exposure to crystalline silica and also the need for proper use of any risk controls that are in place. So that training generally in the regulations will only be able to be provided by an RTO. However, you will need to follow up on site with the use of your risk control measures in the regulations. So there is going to be a need for a combination of some on-site training as well as the training that is in the regulations that is accredited by an RTO. In South Australia at the moment, the only RTO with the silica units on their scope is CITC, but MAQOHSC is talking to other providers, so feel free to contact us and we may be able to help you with that as well. So the dust management strategies that we've always been promoting will have to be written out for each site as a risk control plan. And the guidance on how you write out those risk assessments and how you write that risk control plan are detailed in the national documents that I've got here on the slide, working with crystalline silica substances, working with crystalline silica substances and crystalline silica containing products. But MAQOHSC has some templates and is more than happy to come out and help you with those. There is still a national guide for tunnelling, and tunnelling is brought up in the regulations. So please contact us if you want any help with the new regulations. You will need to document your processes and make sure you have that training, health monitoring and air monitoring being undertaken on a regular basis. Thank you very much for your time.